All right, so welcome, welcome, welcome. We are on both broadcasts again today, and we are on day 10 of Where Do We Go From Here? Again, we've been having some trouble with the Facebook Live being a continual broadcast, but you can always look at the live stream on YouTube on my channel, Church Love 333, the broadcast. There is a continual broadcast, and I do have the chat room up there as well. So we are on day 10, and we've got some serious things to look at here today. I'm going to go ahead and invite some friends in, and thank you for those who are already here joining us live. I would ask you to do the same. If you would invite some of your friends on who enjoy read aloud, who enjoy analysis, who enjoy healthy dialogue when it comes to race, racism, and social injustice. So, welcome you to invite some on. All right. So, let me go ahead and say a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace today, Father. Thank you, Lord God, that your grace is sufficient for every need, every struggle, every trouble, every problem that we have. We thank you, Lord, that your grace is sufficient on today. Father, as we go into this reading today, God, I ask that you give us your wisdom, your knowledge, and your understanding. Help us, oh God, to filter out those things that we don't need, and help us to take what we can from this reading to help make our lives better, to help make our communities better, Father, and to serve our generation in this day and age. In Jesus' name, amen. So again, we are reading from Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. Chaos or Community. And as I said, we're going to probably read through this book all the way to the end of August. We are actually about 21 days into the study of MLK's writings in general. So if you would like to go back and take a look at the other views of this reading, if you go on Facebook and you type in the hashtag chaos or community, you will see the previous read alouds that we've done with this book. Also, if you type in the hashtag why we can't wait and include my first name, you will be able to pull up the videos that we did on MLK's first book that we reviewed, Why We Can't Wait. Now, I don't have those archived on YouTube, but I do have them archived on Facebook Live. So that is where we are. Yesterday, we began to go into what I have termed doctrines from hell, because those doctrines that were false, those doctrines that painted a very different picture of Black Americans as inhuman, inferior, those doctrines are still affecting us today. They're still affecting us today in this country. They're being propagated continually by media. The criminality of Black people, the assumption that Blacks are more criminal than others is still being propagated by our media today. I stumbled across a post, excuse me, earlier this morning, and it was somebody ranting and raving about, where is the Black Lives Matter movement when it's Black on Black crime. Anybody who knows anything about the Black community knows that the Black community does have organizations, and they do protest on a regular basis Black on Black crime. I know several people that are involved with doing that. But again, that goes back to another myth, that there is such a thing as Black on Black crime. There's such a thing as crime on crime. There's such a thing as white on white crime. But again, you don't hear media using that term. Why? Because it does not push a narrative that Black people are more criminal than other people. So please do some research on the myth of black on black crime, because the reality is you're going to kill people, or you're going to commit crime with those who live around you. You're going to commit crime amongst those that you live closest to. White people commit crime at an exceedingly high rate against white people. Why? Because they live in the same vicinity. So we have to stop using and stop falling for narratives that try to paint one group of people as more criminal than another group of people. The same thing with the fatherhood narrative. Please do some research about the myth of the absentee black father. The reality is there are plenty of black fathers who are in the lives of their children, and they're taking care of their children. But again, unless you do research, you would only go with what media is telling you and showing you, to promote an idea of the inferiority or the criminality or the lack of morals within the black community. So this is why I encourage people to turn off your television and do some actual research. Go to the people who are actually researchers. Read books from people who have actually studied these different things, not just taking your information from media. Media has an objective, media has an agenda, and most of the time it is not to paint Black America in a positive light. So if anybody asks me, why don't I look at certain channels? That's why. I like to read. I like to study people who have done the research. I like to study people who have earned a doctorate in researching certain topics. All right. So yes, and there are several research articles out there showing that that is indeed a myth, but yet it continues to get passed around over and over and over and over and over again. Just by the young Black men that I know that are fathers, that are in the home, that are married, that are taking care of their families, I know that's a myth based on my own personal experiences. Welcome, Kelly. Love you, young lady. And so today we are talking about, again, I've been doing this reading on MLK. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And today he is talking about poison minds and moral famine, and what has happened with these doctrines of inferiority that were in the foundation of our country that have really not been dealt with, right? We know they were there. We know that the founding fathers, as we talked about yesterday, the founding fathers actually struggled with slavery. The founding fathers actually struggled with taking a human being and treating them as less than human, as less than human. So it wasn't like they were just dealing with these practices and not really being affected in their conscience by what they were doing. They were, in fact, in their private letters, in their writings to their family members, they were, in fact, dealing with their feelings concerning what many call the peculiar institution, which is slavery. All right. So here he goes on, and we're starting here with where Frederick Douglass said, "It is a marvel that Negroes are still alive," considering the fact that when Emancipation Proclamation was issued, as they said, it was an abstract freedom. So it was a thing of, yes, you're free to go, but we're not going to give you the tools, or we're not going to give you the economic flooring in which to be successful in the future. And of course, we see this continually being played out. We look at what's happening in Milwaukee, right? Again, it's people wanting to blame Democrats for their leadership there. That's part of it. That's part of the issue. But let's look at the fact that what's happening in Milwaukee Milwaukee is still known today as the most segregated place in the United States. So if it's known as the most segregated place in the United States, and it has been that way since supposedly segregation was dealt with by law, then that means that the people who have been in place have chosen to ignore what the law was supposed to deal with for Milwaukee. And it goes back to what MLK says, that a lot of things that were codified and written into law, it was a promise, but the realities were not walked out by the people who were supposed to carry the law out or enforce the law. So now we have angry people. I didn't say they were right. I just said they were angry. Angry people tearing up stuff, burning down stuff. And we want to say, this is some of the comments I've read. We want to say it's their fault. We want to say drop a bomb drone on them. This is some of the comments people are making. But we're still not dealing with the fact that if it's known as the most segregated place in the country, that means that there are people who are aware that these people's civil rights have continually been violated. So yes, we want to put the blame on what's happening now with the people who are burning down things in ignorance, but we're not going back to who's not enforcing the civil rights of these people. So again, we're still putting all over the screen, all over the media, the fruit of a bigger problem, which is these people feeling as if their civil rights have never been established. So nobody's talking about that. It's almost a foregone conclusion that, oh yeah, we know that this place is really, really segregated, and we know that their rights have been ignored. But let's talk about them tearing up their community. Let's not talk about the fact that everybody knows these people's civil and human rights have been ignored. I don't see anybody talking about that. So if you know that their civil and human rights have been ignored, that's really what we should be focusing on. And that's what the community should be providing solutions for. If that makes any sense. I'm just saying. All right, so we're going to move on. In dealing with the ambivalence of white America, we must not overlook another form of racism that was relentlessly pursued on American shores: the physical extermination of the American Indian. Now, in case some of you don't know, I am Black American and I'm also Native American. So I get to talk a little bit about, or understand a little bit about, this piece of extermination of the American Indian. The South American example of absorbing the indigenous Indian population was ignored in the United States, and systemic destruction of a whole people was undertaken. The common phrase, "the only good Indian is a dead Indian," was virtually elevated to national policy. Unfortunately, I've actually heard some of the same sentiments about Black America. That either the only good Black American is a dead one, or maybe we should have just, left them in slavery. They would have been better off. And these are not statements, let me reiterate, these are not statements being said by white nationalists. So this is the kind of verbiage that's being stirred up in our country. And I would say a lot of it has to do with the media's portrayal of Black America. from the news to entertainment to other segments. Thus, the poisoning of the American mind was accomplished not only by acts of discrimination and exploitation, but by the exaltation of murder as an expression of the courage and initiative of the pioneer. So back then, what MLK is saying is that it was seen as a good thing to go in and murder a group of people, and applauded for that, and you were exalted as a hero in the past for being a part of the group of people that eliminated another group of people. And if you don't think that's true in 2016 about Black America, go check the GoFundMe pages that get started when someone kills a Black American in this country. Just go check. Whether they are guilty or whether they are, whether they have done it rightfully, or whether they have been within the law or without or outside of the law. All of a sudden, this person, whoever does it, becomes a hero, and a GoFundMe page is started, and they're seen as courageous for taking the life of a person from another people group. So he's saying that when you make this the norm, or when you make this an acceptable behavior, it helps to establish an idea in someone's mind that it's okay to take the life of another person from another people group. He goes on to say, just as Southern culture was made to appear noble by ignoring the cruelty of slavery, the conquest of the Indian was depicted as an example of bravery and progress. Thus, through 2 centuries of continuous indoctrination of Americans, has separated people according to mythically superior and inferior qualities, while a democratic spirit of equality was evoked as the national ideal. These concepts of racism and this schizophrenic duality of conduct remain deeply rooted in American thought today. This tendency of the nation to take one step forward on the question of racial justice and then to take a step backward is still the pattern. Just as an ambivalent nation freed the slaves a century ago with no plan or no program to make their freedom meaningful, the still ambivalent nation in 1954 declared school segregation unconstitutional with no plan or no program to make the integration real. So again, it goes back to, if you know that a particular city is segregated, it's the most segregated place in the nation, and you don't have a plan or a program to make integration real, then what you get, unfortunately, is angry people who are at their boiling point. Again, didn't say it was right. Didn't say it was right. But the reality is you've got to address their civil rights or their human rights being violated. And you've got to address what's the plan and what the programs. Was there any plan established? Have there been any programs to help those that you know are struggling? And as we just saw a presidential candidate drive through where this unrest was to go talk to an audience that was 95% white, he didn't talk to the people of Milwaukee. He talked about them to other people. He talked about their problems, but he still did not answer with a solution, a program, or a plan. All right. Just as the Congress passed a civil rights bill in 1868 and refused to enforce it, thank you, Stephanie. The Congress passed a civil rights bill in 1964, and to this day, listen, Congress passed a civil rights bill in 1964, and to this day has failed to enforce it in all its dimensions. And we know recently our Supreme Court gutted some of the Voting Rights Act, and now you have the same types of attitudes in place to block people from voting. They are now back. So the things that held racists and segregationists in place, because the Voting Rights Act was gutted, now they have an opportunity to come in and use policy to discriminate. All right. Just as the 15th Amendment in 1870 proclaimed Negro suffrage only to permit its de facto withdrawal in half of the nation, so in the 1965 voting rights law was passed and then permitted to languish with only fractional and half-hearted implementation. The civil rights measures of the 1960s engraved solemn rights in the legal literature. But after writing piecemeal and incomplete legislation and proclaiming its historic importance and magnificence, the American government left the Negro to make the unworkable work. I'm going to read that again. The American government left the Negro to make the unworkable work. Against entrenched segregationist state power with almost total dependence economically on those they had to contend with, and without political experience, the impoverished Negro was expected to usher in an era of freedom and plenty. When the war against poverty came into being in 1964, it seemed to herald a new day of compassion. It was the bold assertion that the nation would no longer stand complacently by while millions of its citizens smothered in poverty in the midst of opulence. But it did not take long to discover that the government was only willing to appropriate such a limited budget that it could not launch a good skirmish against poverty, much less a full-scale war. So you're talking about launching a war on poverty, but then you give it a very scarce budget to actually deal with poverty. We don't give our military, right, a scarce budget. I know people are complaining now about this current president and how he's scaling down our military and those kind of things. But in MLK's day, he makes a point of saying that you can't launch a war on poverty and then don't fund that war on poverty correctly or adequately enough so that it's actually doing some damage. All right. So he goes on to say, moreover, the poverty program, in which concept elated the Negro poor, became so embroiled in political turmoil that its insufficiencies were magnified and its operations paralyzed. Big city machines felt threatened by it, and small towns, especially in the South, directed it away from Negroes. Its good intentions and limited objectives were frustrated by the skillful maneuvers of experienced politicians. The worst effect of these manipulations was to cast doubt upon the program as a whole and discredit those Negroes involved directly in its administration. In 1965, the president presented a new plan to Congress, which it finally passed in 1966, for rebuilding entire slum neighborhoods. With other elements of the program, it would, in his words, make the decaying cities of the present into the masterpieces of our civilization. This demonstration cities plan is imaginative, It embodies social vision and properly defines racial discrimination as a central evil. However, the ordinary Negro, though no social or political analyst, will be skeptical. He will be skeptical first because of the insufficient funds assigned to the program. He will be skeptical second because he knows how many laws exist in northern states and cities prohibiting discrimination in housing, in education, and in employment. He knows how many overlapping commissions exist to enforce the terms of these laws, but yet he knows where he lives. The discrimination in his life tells him that laws on paper, no matter how imposing their terms, will not guarantee that he will live in this masterpiece of civilization. So again, you can write something on paper, but getting people to enforce it has been the issue. Throughout our history, our laws affirming Negro rights have consistently been circumvented by ingenious evasions which render them void in practice. Laws that affect the whole population, draft laws, income tax laws, traffic laws, manage to work even though they may be unpopular. But laws passed for the Negro's benefit are so widely unenforced that it is a mockery to call them laws. There is a tragic gulf between civil rights passed and civil rights laws implemented. And I believe that is the frustration you see across this country. There's a gulf between civil rights passed and civil rights laws implemented. There is a double standard in the enforcement of law and a double standard in the respect for particular laws. All of this tells us that the white backlash is nothing new. White America has been backlashing on the fundamental God-given and human rights of Negro Americans for more than 300 years. With all of her dazzling achievements and stupendous material strides, America has maintained its strange ambivalence on the question of racial justice. So MLK is talking about some of the very same things that we're dealing with in 2016. Yes, there are laws in place. No, these laws are not followed. Yes, we can say there are laws written to protect the rights of every man. But in practice, we see that those laws are not enforced when it comes to Black Americans. Yes, we are very specific when it comes to wanting to establish the rights of the unborn in the womb. Yes, we are very specific when it comes to wanting to establish marriage between one man and one woman. No, we are not very specific when it comes to racial justice. We always have an excuse in this country, as to why it's okay for racial injustices to continue to exist and to continue to permeate throughout our systems in this country. And the ironic thing is, we think God is winking at this. So we think that God has righteous anger against what's happening against the institution of marriage. We believe that God has righteous anger against what's happening with abortion, but we think God is just back and drinking a cup of lemonade when it comes to racial injustice. So we don't think that God holds racial injustice or any injustice to the same degree as he holds other things. As MLK said, there is an ambivalence on the question of racial justice in our country. So we got to deal with that. He goes on to say, to define much of white America as self-deluded on the commitment to equality and to apprehend the broad base on which it rests are not to enthrone pessimism. The racism of today is real, but the democratic spirit that has always faced it is equally real. The value in pulling racism out of its obscurity and stripping it of its rationalization lies in the confidence that it can be changed. I actually happen to agree with him as well as Dr. Jane Elliott. She said the same thing. We could end racism if we wanted to in this country. If we removed the ambivalence and we were actually intentional about racial justice and equality, we could end it. To live with the pretense that racism is a doctrine of a very few is to disarm us in fighting it frontally as scientifically unsound, morally repugnant, and socially destructive. The prescription for the cure rests with the accurate diagnosis of the disease. A people who began a national life inspired by a vision of society of brotherhood can redeem itself. But redemption can come only through a humble acknowledgement of guilt and an honest knowledge of self. So if you're fighting responsibility, if you're fighting the guilt that America does have for creating, literally creating, I'm talking about slave breeding, for literally creating an entire population that became the quote unquote Negro problem. America is fighting that part of her history. That the same people that you call problems, or the ancestors of the people that you call problems, would not be here had it not been for the continual practice of slavery and slave breeding. So there's a quote unquote problem that you started. So MLK says you got to acknowledge your part in what you are now calling the problem, and an honest knowledge of self, recognizing, do I have some prejudice I need to deal with? Do I have some bigotry I need to deal with? Have I been ambivalent on the subject of racial justice? Have I kind of felt like, well, it doesn't really concern me, doesn't really concern my household, so why should I care about it? But we say, and crown thy good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea. So if we are the brotherhood in this great country, then it should be something you're concerned about, especially if you are a believer, right? Okay, we'll keep going. Jesus once told a parable of a young man who left home and wandered into a far country where he sought life and adventure after adventure, but he found only frustration and bewilderment. The farther he moved from his father's house, the closer he came to the house of despair. And here MLK is alluding to the story of the prodigal son, if you are not familiar with the biblical text. After the boy had wasted all and famine developed in the land, and he ended up seeking food in a pig's trough, but the story does not end here. In a state of disillusionment, frustration, and homesickness, the boy came to himself and said, I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. The prodigal son was not himself when he left his father's house, or when he dreamed that pleasure was the end of life. Only when he made up his mind to go home and be a son again did he come to himself. The boy returned home to find a loving father waiting with outstretched arms and a heart filled with joy. This is an analogy to what white America confronts today. Like all human analogies, it is imperfect, but it does suggest some parallels worth considering. America has strayed to the far country of racism. Think about that. I'm going to take a sip right there. America has strayed to the far country of racism. The home that all too many Americans left was solidly structured idealistically. Its pillars were soundly grounded in the insights of our Judeo-Christian heritage. All men are made in the image of God. All men are brothers. All men are created equal. Every man is heir to a legacy of dignity and worth. Every man has rights that are neither conferred by nor derived from the state. They are God-given. What a marvelous foundation for any home. What a glorious place to inhabit. But America strayed away, and this excursion has brought only confusion and bewilderment. It has left hearts aching with guilt and minds distorted with irrationality. It has driven wisdom from the throne. This long and callous sojourn in the far country of racism has brought moral and spiritual famine to the nation. And I don't think people recognize or realize how much of our moral and spiritual famine is based in what we are refusing to do in terms of justice. I can sing God Bless America, but I really need to be singing America Bless God. And how do we get back to blessing God? We get back to actually following his word says, not just in specific areas, but in all areas. Love mercy, do justly, walk humbly with our God. But he goes on to say, but it is not too late to return home. If America would come to herself and return to her true home, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, she would give the Democratic creed a new, authentic ring, enkindle the imagination of mankind, and fire the souls of men. If she fails, she will be victimized with the ultimate social psychosis that can lead only to national suicide. In 1944, Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish economist, wrote in An American Dilemma, "The Negro problem is not only America's greatest failure, but also America's incomparably great opportunity for the future. If America should follow its own deepest convictions, its well-being at home would be increased directly. At the same time, America's prestige and power abroad would rise immensely. The century-old dream of American patriots that America should give to the entire world its own freedoms and its own faith would come true. America can demonstrate that justice, equality, and cooperation are possible between white and black people. America is free to choose whether the Negro shall remain her liability or become her opportunity." That's a prophetic word. America is free to choose whether the Negro shall remain her liability or become her opportunity. Believe it or not, people believe that You know, America is looked down upon because of abortion. America is looked down upon because of the loss of morality in terms of marriage between one man and one woman. But America is also looked down upon worldwide because of her treatment of the Black American. So again, I believe that was a prophetic warning. America is free to choose whether the Negro shall remain her liability or become her opportunity to show the world that what you put down on paper, liberty and justice for all, that you're able and that you're capable as a nation of actually demonstrating that in practice. He goes on to say, this is white America's most urgent challenge today. If America is to respond creatively to the challenge, many individuals, groups, and agencies must rise above the hypocrisies of the past and begin to make an immediate and determined part in changing the face of their nation. If the country has not yet emerged with a massive program to end the blight surrounding the life of the Negro, one is forced to believe that the answers have not been forthcoming because there is, as of yet, no genuine and widespread conviction that such fundamental changes are needed and needed now. So, where there is no conviction to change, then changes will not be made. And here it is, almost 50 years later, and my question would be, where is the conviction to change? Yeah. As a first step on the journey home, the journey to full equality, we will have to engage in a radical reordering of national priorities. As the Carnegie Quarterly declares, a great deal of money is spent in this country every day for education and for housing, freeways, war, national parks, liquor, cosmetics, advertisement, and a lot of other things. It is a question of the allocation of money, which means the establishing of priorities. All right, let's go to part 2. Thank you for bearing with me, my YouTube audience here. All right, it appears that we are back. Gotta love the National Spy Association. Gotta love, gotta love, gotta love. Gotta love good old Facebook. Gotta love the good old predominantly white males that run these systems. We see you. So we are back on for part 2. Apparently, I can't talk for more than 30 to 35 minutes at a time before Facebook cuts off my video. So, part 2, day 10, poison minds and moral famine, which is where we are. I'm going to go back up because I'm not sure how much was cut off on part 1. But I'll start with where MLK talks about white America's most urgent challenge. This is white America's most urgent challenge today. If America is to respond creatively to the challenge, many individuals, groups, and agencies must rise above the hypocrisies of the past and begin to take an immediate and determined part in changing the face of their nation. If the country has not yet emerged with a massive program to end the blight surrounding the life of the Negro, one is forced to believe that the answers have not been forthcoming because there is as yet no genuine and widespread conviction that such fundamental changes are needed and needed now. As a first step on the journey home, the journey to full equality, we will have to engage in a radical reordering of national priorities. As the Carnegie Quarterly declares, it is a question of the allocation of money, which means the establishing of priorities. Then he asks a very important question. Are we more concerned with the size, power, and wealth of our society, or with creating a more just society? So what are we more concerned about? Are we concerned about wealth, power, and size, or are we concerned about justice? The failure to pursue justice is not only a moral default. Without it, social tensions will grow and the turbulence in the streets will persist despite disapproval or repressive action. Now remember, he is writing this warning in 1968. Here we are in 2016, and we are seeing the social tensions growing and the turbulence in the streets growing. Even more, a withered sense of justice in an expanding society leads to corruption of the life of all Americans. All too many of those who live in affluent America ignore those who exist in poor America. In doing so, the affluent Americans will eventually have to face themselves with the question that Eichmann chose to ignore. How responsible am I for the well-being of my fellows? Excuse me. There we go. How responsible am I for the well-being of my fellows? To ignore evil is to become an accomplice to it. Yet another famous MLK quote, but here it is in context. To ignore evil is to become an accomplice to it. So if I ignore injustice happening with the poor, then I become an accomplice to injustice. Now, that statement probably will offend a lot of people who would say, well, I'm not directly involved in injustice, but you're ignoring it. So what he's pointing out here is that ignoring only postpones the inevitable face-off that the wealthy will have with the poor. If you know anything about history, that was certainly true for the French Revolution. Just check out a book on the French Revolution and what happened when the poor were ignored by the wealthy. Today, the exploration of space is engaging not only our enthusiasm, but our patriotism. Developing it as a global race, we have intensified its inherent drama and brought its adventure into every living room, nursery, shop, and office. No such fervor or exhilaration attends the war on poverty. So MLK is kind of pointing out here that nationally during his time, where you placed your money, right? What programs you funded adequately kind of show where your priorities were. So he's talking here now about the space program as opposed to adequately funding the war on poverty. There is impatience with its problems, indifference toward its progress, and hostility toward its errors. Without denying the value of scientific endeavor, there's a striking absurdity in committing billions to reach the moon, where no people live, while only a fraction of that amount is appropriated to service the densely populated slums. So MLK is basically saying it makes no sense to explore other worlds and funnel all this money into exploring other worlds where nobody lives, but you won't adequately or properly fund programs that will help dismantle the slums that are currently in existence. I'm sure somebody had a problem with that. If these strange values persist, in a few years, we can be assured that when we set a man on the moon with an adequate telescope, he will be able to see the slums on Earth with their intensified congestion, decay, and turbulence. On what scale of values is this a program of progress? In the wasteland of war, the expenditure of resources knows no restraints. Here, our abundance is fully recognized and enthusiastically squandered. The recently revealed misestimate of the war budget amounts to $10 billion for a single year. The era alone is more than 5 times the amount committed to anti-poverty programs. If we reverse investments and gave the armed forces the anti-poverty budget, the generals could be forgiven if they walked off the battlefield in disgust. The Washington Post has calculated that we spend $332,000 for each enemy we kill. That was back in 1968. It challenges the imagination to contemplate what lives we could transform if we were to cease killing. The security we profess to seek in foreign adventures, we will lose in our decaying cities. The bombs in Vietnam explode at home. They destroyed the hopes and possibilities for a decent America. A considerable part of the Negro's efforts of the past decades has been devoted, particularly in the South, to attaining a sense of dignity. For us, enduring the sacrifices of beatings, jailings, and even death was acceptable merely to have access to public accommodations. To sit at a lunch counter or occupy the front seat of a bus had no effect on our material standard of living, but in removing a caste stigma, it revolutionized our psychology and elevated the spiritual content of our being. Instinctively, we struck out for dignity first because personal degradation as an inferior human being was even more keenly felt than material privation. But dignity is also corroded by poverty, no matter how poetically we invest the humble with simple graces and charm. No worker can maintain his morale or sustain his spirit if in the marketplace his capacities are declared to be worthless to society. The Negro is no longer ashamed that he is black. He should never have permitted himself to accept the absurd concept that white is more virtuous than black. But he was crushed by the propaganda that superiority had a pale countenance. That day is fast coming to an end. However, in his search for human dignity, he is handicapped by the stigma of poverty in a society whose measure of value revolves about money. If the society changes its concepts by placing the responsibility on its system, not on the individual, and guarantees secure employment or a minimum income, dignity will come within reach of all. For Negroes, the goal on which they have placed the highest priority, which the emancipation from slavery was intended to assure, will be finally attained. Meanwhile, any discussion of the problems of inequality is meaningless unless a time dimension is given to programs for their solution. The Great Society is only a phrase so long as no date is set for the achievement of its promises. It is disquieting to note that President Johnson, in his message to Congress on the Demonstration Cities program, stated, "If we can begin now, the planning from which action will flow, the hopes of the 20th century will become the realities of the 21st. On this timetable, many Negroes not yet born and virtually all now alive will not experience equality. The virtue of patience will become a vice if it accepts so leisurely an approach to social change." We're going to stop there for today, but I want to review a few concepts here. First of all, MLK ends this section by talking about the fact that it was disturbing to note that President Johnson basically said, your hope that we're establishing in the 20th century can become a reality in the 21st century. You're talking about 100 years. And so MLK is saying this leisure approach to social change, this leisure approach to justice, this leisure approach to equality means that people who are not yet even born will not experience equality. He was concerned about that. He also talked about ignoring the plight of the poor will only postpone the inevitable face-off between the affluent and those who are dealing with inequality and those who are poor. He talked about America really is free to choose whether Black America will be seen as a liability or if we will become an opportunity to show the world that you really do care about justice and equality. He expressed the concern that there is no conviction to change what is happening. There is no genuine, widespread conviction that fundamental changes need to be made in our society. He was concerned about the fact that you establish a program, but then you don't allocate an adequate budget for that program. So of course it's going to fail. And of course, we're now seeing the results and the fallouts of lots of failed programs in the United States. But it goes back to something that MLK pointed out that a lot of people don't point out today in 2016. And that is failure to adequately fund these programs. I don't hear anybody talking about that. The fact that America is in a state of moral famine and spiritual famine because of our refusal to address justice. Justice, right? And unenforced laws. So we have laws on the books, but they're not being enforced in communities. I know a word that comes up a lot when people are talking about Black America, and it is this word called entitlement. Entitlement. Well, let's look at entitlement. What is entitlement? Entitlement means that something was done to you or to your people group that makes you expectant of something given to you, right? So if we look historically at what has happened in this country with Black Americans, it's almost, I would say, like you would have to be in a cave somewhere or have never read any book on American history to understand what has happened with Black America, why there are inequalities that do exist, and why Black America would say we still have yet to experience equality. Equality. So a lot of what people are saying is a mentality of entitlement is actually a mentality of we have yet to experience true and full equality in this country. That's not an opinion. There are several reports out that supports the fact that Black Americans have yet to experience equality, full equality in this country. It's not an opinion. I'll say it again. It's not an opinion. So, please, before you use the word entitlement, do some research on the disparities of Black Americans in this country. Do some actual research on how long Black Americans have actually been fighting simply to be treated as equal. Equal, not special, equal. All right, so that is where we're going to stop for today. Friday is going to be very interesting. Friday, we're going to talk about what MLK coins as the white liberal. The white liberal. He talks about that in detail. So we're going to spend some time talking about what he terms as the white liberal. I don't think he's referring to what we call the white liberal today, but he's talking about the white person who wants to be an ally to justice for Black America. So based on what I read, I believe that is what he's talking about more so than the way we use white liberal today. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the white liberal in terms of those who want to help Black America and what he dealt with and the issues that he saw with the help. So if you want to be a white ally, if you want to be someone who says, I believe in justice for all people, I see the inequalities that are happening in Black America, I really am concerned, I would encourage you to tune in tomorrow to see what MLK had to say about those who wanted to help the cause. Those who wanted to help the cause. So that's what we're going to talk about on Friday. And again, if you have not gotten your own copy, I encourage you to get a copy of Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. This was the last book written by Martin Luther King before he was assassinated. Reading through this, you can see probably why he was assassinated. You know, he was telling it like it was. He was giving the truth to the Black community. He was giving the truth to the Black Power movement. He was giving his truth to the white community. He was giving his truth on war and all of these different issues that it seems to be plaguing America even today. So I would encourage you, get your own copy of this book. Toward the end, as we close out, he does have an appendix on some different programs and prospects and things that he thought would help Black America, would help our country to move forward. So I am excited about getting to the end of this book and sharing those writings with you. All right, so that is our talk for today. Again, this is part 2. So please go back and look at part 1 of today. And I appreciate you joining me live. Thank you for your time and attention. And I understand that time is precious. So thank you for viewing. Feel free to share this with your family, with your friends, and with your followers. Take care and God bless. Also, thank you for those of you who have watched this broadcast as well. I do appreciate your time, and I hope that you will go back and you will watch the previous videos on this topic. Take care and God bless.